To the House. Thank you very much.
Call Moana Mackie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as a member of the Local Government and Environment Select Committee that considered this bill, I'm very happy to take a call and congratulate my colleague, the Honourable Trevor Mallard, on shepherding this piece of legislation through the House. He worked very hard at Select Committee as the conduit between our committee and the Hutt City Council to ensure that the changes we were considering were deemed to be both acceptable and effective by the Hutt City Council, and I think we've ended up with a piece of legislation which is not only workable but I think will be very effective in the Hutt City Council's fight to eradicate graffiti in their area. And the issue of graffiti and tagging has been a major issue in Lower Hutt, going back many years. This is not a new issue. This is not something the council has only just decided to try and address, although I do note that that Mayor Ray Wallace did make it a plank of his election campaign was a war on graffiti. So unfortunately, graffiti in Lower Hutt is one of the worst areas in the country for tagging and for graffiti, and given that it actually is such a lovely part of the Wellington district, anything that serves to better the image of that community and throughout the rest of Wellington and the country is indeed welcome. And before I came into Parliament, I was a member of the Petone Community Board in Lower Hutt, and graffiti was one of the main issues that people brought to us as a community board, along with the protection of heritage buildings. One of the biggest issues that our community faced was the issue of tagging and graffiti. People would come to our community board meetings when, for example, there was a public building or a private residence that was significantly damaged, significantly graffitied, that they couldn't understand why nothing was being done about it. And when they would come to us and we would liaise with council officers, what we often found were the very problems that have led to this piece of legislation, which is that often the people who own the buildings were absentee, they weren't there, often they hadn't been paying rates. So it was clear that they'd basically just departed from the district and really had no more interest in the upkeep of that building. In the case of private buildings, sometimes they were dealing with tenants who weren't able to either fix it themselves or didn't have the financial means, or felt that under the law, under residential tenancy legislation, it should be the landlord's responsibility to do that work. But whereas the council could often get the approval of the tenants, getting the approval of the landlords who actually own the property was sometimes very difficult to do. So we often ended up in the situation of having to say to them, well, we don't have a right to just walk onto someone's property and make alterations. We cannot find the people who own the building, we cannot find the people who lease the building, and therefore our hands are really tied, which obviously doesn't go down particularly well with the members of the community who pay rates and who feel very proud about their community and get very disturbed and upset when they see buildings being defaced in the way that they unfortunately have been throughout Lower Hutt and in fact throughout the country. And I think the comment that this is perhaps something that could be picked up by other councils is very pertinent, but as a member of the Local Government and Environment Select Committee, which has an enormous amount of legislation before it, we'd probably rather see one government bill than 60 different local government bills coming to our committee on this issue. So maybe it's something that the government could pick up to see whether or not there is a need and a demand for it throughout the rest of the country. As I said, our committee's done the work on it, Trevor Mallard's done the work on it, certainly the Hutt City Council and the issues historically that they've been facing with tagging and graffiti provided a very good basis for developing this legislation. I think it'll be very easy to pick it up and roll it out throughout the rest of the country. And there are many reasons why this is an important issue. It might not seem like a big issue to some people, but serious issues of tagging and graffiti do affect property values for those people who live in the community around them. If someone sees an area where there is an enormous amount of tagging, where there may be a row of buildings owned by someone who's not present in the district and is not contactable, it can send a message out about that community that is very negative, that may affect the property values of other people around them, even if in fact that negative perception is not true. And so in terms of the rights of other property owners in that area, this is a very important piece of legislation for them. But I think one of the biggest reasons why this is important is because quick removal of tagging in particular, but graffiti in general, provides a strong disincentive against doing it again. And what we do know is that the longer it's left there, the longer the taggers the graffiti, the people who are doing the graffiti can get the satisfaction of seeing it, the more likely they are to try to do it again or have the message that if I do it, this is something that's going to be there long term, no one's going to do anything about it, I can brag about it. The quicker you get rid of it and make it clear that as soon as it goes up, it's coming down, then the quicker they'll lose interest in going to those buildings and carrying out this particular destructive activity. And I do want to note that the Hutt City Council has been dealing with this for a long time. They do have a graffiti eradication officer. They have been spending up to $500,000 a year on graffiti removal in their community. And through their graffiti eradication officer, they have been working with the community. So this isn't simply just this is the only thing we're going to do and the minute it goes up we're going to take it down kind of approach. They have been engaging with the community, trying to address the underlying issues in those communities that do lead to this antisocial behaviour, that do lead to this destructive behaviour, and that's a very important part of the equation because times are very tough, and unfortunately when times get really tough, often we see an increase in these levels of antisocial behaviour, and I'd hate to see this bill not being put into the context, or not being seen in the context, of the very difficult economic times in which we find ourselves, and put it back on the government. A number of who have made very positive comments about this piece of legislation, and we certainly welcome their support for it. But just to say to them, don't ever forget that that the government, they have a role in ensuring that we have the kind of economy and the kind of community that doesn't lead to vast increases in antisocial behaviour because of economic hardship. And certainly, I know around the country we've seen increases in antisocial behaviour. So don't take it out of context. Don't think that this is fixing, this is actually a much, much bigger problem. And sometimes I think, we can get ourselves into this little bubble of this piece of legislation and lose sight of the big picture, which is that we need to deal with the core causes of antisocial behaviour, of this kind of destructive behaviour, of young people who feel so disconnected from their community that they can just go out and deface it. And that's a worrying trend that you see, and it's easy to just write them off and say, well, they're call them names and do this and that and the other thing. But let's not be that glib about it. Is all that I would say. And I think you only have to look around the world at some of the antisocial behaviour that's coming out of communities, and in particular young people, to see that there is something there that needs to be addressed. You never excuse the behaviour, but it's important to try and understand it and see if there's something far more serious lying at the basis of it. The Select Committee made a number of important changes to the legislation. One was actually including a definition of graffiti. And again, I think again it's important to put that in context, which is the Hutt City Council made it quite clear to us that there wasn't a lot of grey area in terms of the buildings that they were talking about. It wasn't as though there were concerns, and I think we addressed them at Select Committee around the definition of graffiti, about where you get that line between graffiti and art. And what the council said to us was, we're not dealing with any cases where we think anyone would seriously think that this was art. We're dealing with cases where this is clearly tagging, it's clearly meant to offend, it's clearly meant to damage, it's pretty cut and dry. But yes, having a definition in there would mean that if we ever did come up with a case from time to time where there might be that line, then we have no problem with that level with that safety net, if you like, being put there in the legislation. But I think in terms of what the Hutt City Council are dealing with, and for people who might be listening to this debate and worrying that we're going to be starting to get into that area where the lines are blurred, we're not. What they're trying to deal with in the Hutt City is clearly graffiti, it's clearly meant to offend, and this legislation will give them the ability to deal with that. We also made it very clear that this is in public sight. So in terms of extending the powers of a council to go onto private property, it's where it's visible from a public point of view. So right around the back of the house, the council wouldn't have the right to go around there. I mean, there were some people who thought they should have the right to go all the way around and remove graffiti if it was offensive and if it was just meant to deface. But we were very clear this is where it's viewed from a public viewpoint. We were very clear this isn't about graffiti art, even though the council were telling us That's absolutely not a problem. And I want to commend the Hutt City Council. They've done an awful lot of work. They've done an awful lot of work with utility providers because power poles, power boxes are a target for taggers. I just want to acknowledge a huge amount of work that's gone in, that they've put in trying to address the problem without having to come to Parliament and ask for legislation. They've done amazing work, and now here we find ourselves with them saying we just need this bit of legislation for you to get us over the line so that we really can declare the war on graffiti that Mayor Wallace said he was going to do when he was elected.
Members, this debate is concluded. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Now, you can only ask for a party vote if you're voting against it. Are you voting against it? You only ask for a party vote if you're disputing the call that I gave, and I said the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Hutt City Council Graffiti Removal Bill, third reading.
Call on Members' Order of the Day number 1.
Minimum Wage Amendment.